Excellent. I shall start my timer because I'm on a strict timelines. First of all, thank you so much for all coming, and well done on finding this, because this room is in the beyond, back and beyond, but at least it's nice and quiet. So thank you very much for taking the time. So what I'm going to talk to you about is really a rather self-indulgent history of adventures, and from Revolution's perspective in particular. I want to talk about the community, because any developer that doesn't really value their community is a fool, because our success, if it comes, is due to our community. We value them enormously, and I hope by the end of this talk you'll see why I say that with utter sincerity. And then I also want to talk about the journey of Revolution, the ups and the downs, which I hope is a good story, and you can tell me afterwards if you think so or not. And then finally, because the Nintendo Switch version of Broken Sword 5 launched yesterday, which was very exciting, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about that as well. All in good time to give some questions and answers. I have Stefano sort of glaring at me already, and I suspect that he's got his this is Stefano, his timer going, and I'm going to be in big trouble. So what I'd like to do is really start from the very beginning. And I did warn you that this was going to be self-indulgent. So this is the first computer that I wrote an adventure for. It is the Sinclair ZX81. Has anyone ever seen one of those or heard of them? Yeah, oh, good. You have one. Brilliant. Aren't they wonderful? It has one whole K of memory. Now, I don't want to patronize you, but I kind of do it for myself. This has 128 million times as much memory as this computer. I mean, it's extraordinary, isn't it? But in 1981, when I was young back then, I have to say, really quite young, this computer had the same memory and the processing power that had landed Apollo 11, the computers that had Apollo 11 on the moon. So under the circumstances, in that context, it was the most extraordinary thing. And of course, everybody bought them for their kids, for the homework, all of that. But obviously what people really bought them for was to play games. And one of the things I'm actually rather proud of is the company that I was involved in. It was nothing to do with me. I actually wrote a chess program in 1K, and it really played a great game of chess. I mean, now a shortcut on your desktop is 4 or 5K. I mean, what they do with it, I have no idea. But that was what it was. So the ZX81 really was the introduction to a whole generation of British and French, and the Germans went for Commodore, but the British and the French and the Belgians went for the Sinclair. It was short-lived because technology was moving on very fast, but it was actually a very interesting design because it meant that when you bought your Spectrum, at least you had an ongoing use for your ZX81. I wrote my first game, which was unimaginatively entitled Adventure B. The brighter amongst you may realize that this wasn't the first adventure in the series, also, I remember, because this was an acronym of the founders' initials, I took it upon myself to design a logo, and I designed a truck. I mean, really extraordinarily naive. And it was a text adventure. I am in a jungle clearing. I'm sure many of you know text adventures, and if you do, you will know that they are a lot better than this. This was pretty rubbish, but it was my first attempt. I do like the idea that when I first started, we used to sell our games directly to audiences, either through mail order at things called microfairs. And it was wonderful because you'd have trestle tables and you'd just get to meet the people. And I'd like to use this particular example because a young man sidled up to me, I remember, and he said, will you sign my game? And I thought this was brilliant, so I signed it. And he said, I managed to convince the missus that I was buying this ZX81 for our son because it was good for his homework. And I said, yes, and we kind of winked at each other in a knowing way. He said, then she came along and she saw your spelling. Can't really should have an apostrophe. Chisel is not spelt with a Z. And if you want, I can send you a corrections. And it was because, I mean, it's just appalling, isn't it? But people didn't mind apart from him. I mean, it was all really, really fun. A little bit later, we became much more professional. Called it Inca Curse. The truck took a much, much smaller prominence. And of course, it was straight out of Indiana Jones' Raiders of the Lost Ark, which at the time had launched only a year or so before and was so inspirational, and still is in many ways, because it's such a great film. And this was just the beginning of us becoming a little bit more professional. The reason I show this is that, and look, this is my partner, Richard Turner. He was the very definition of a bedroom coder, because he was coding in his bedroom. And his sister, who was very excited by all this, did an enormous, great Arctic Computing logo. And she drew it, and it took her days and days and days. And none of us quite realized how rubbish the whole thing was. Everything was produced on tapes, of course, and duplicated on tapes, and etc. And as I say, what we used to do, here's me with a little bit more hair, selling games. And look, there are some women. I mean, that's Richard's mother. And maybe that's my girlfriend, I don't know. But it was, I mean, without wishing to be in any way controversial, it was very much a male-dominated industry. And thank God it's much, much more diverse now. But at the time, a few long-suffering girlfriends came along. But broadly, it was, there were games written by boys for boys. But it was fun. It was fun. So let's fast forward now to 1990. This was 1981, 1982, 1983. It was a golden era for British developers. It was a time when Elite came out for the BBC Micro and other formats. And I remember in about 1985 sitting, and a tape came through, and it was Impossible Mission on the Commodore 64. A few people maybe nodding. And it was just so much better than anything else. And more seriously, it was so much better than we were even aspiring to. And I realized that actually everything was changing. It was a great game. It really was a great game. So I personally, after that, was approached by a company called US Gold, worked for them. And it was tough because the title that we were producing at the time was Outrun. And obviously, as head of development, I had to play it through many times to make sure that we had an arcade-perfect version. But it was great. And then I moved on to Activision in the very early days. And then in 1990, I decided that actually I wanted to go back into developing my own games. And that was the beginning of Revolution. So a group of us got together. The first game was a game called Year of the Temptress that we produced in 1992. Ironically, Revolution's always been very proud of the fact that we've always had strong female protagonists. So, you know, George and Nico most recently in Broken Sword. So it's sort of ironic that the game was called Year of the Temptress, and I'm going to briefly tell you why that happened. We were working for a company called Mirrorsoft, who's our publisher, and the head of marketing, a woman called Alison Beasley, phoned me up and said, we need to come up with a name, send us names. So I came up with a load of crappy names, and at the bottom, it was Lure of the Temptress, and I put in brackets, we can't call it that. And she phoned me back, and she said, we have to call it Lure of the Temptress, it's just a great name. And I said, Alison, look, honestly, it was a joke, because there are two reasons why we can't call it Lure of the Temptress. And she said, what are they? I said, first, there's no luring, and two, there's no temptress. And I swear to God, she said, there was a pause, she said, we think the game's a little bit short. Could you, if we extend it by a few months, can you add some luring and a temptress? So I did. And this is what the game, and this is where it all came from. But what's kind of interesting about this, I think, is that two things. First of all, this is very much a 16 color. So this style that you can see is very much defined by the limitations. And in developing games, I mean, those limitations have virtually vanished now, but you can very much get the sort of sense of a game from its era. So on the Atari ST, it was 16 color, 320 by 200, and actually it's more than 16 colors. Sorry, it's 256. No, I don't know. Do you know, I really can't remember. But the sprites had to be the same, that they shared the palette. So you had this very sort of simplistic look. Very much a sort of Dungeons and Dragons type, squalls are orcs, etc., etc. And I wanted to write a game, having handled Sierra, I wanted to write a game that got away from the seriousness. Now, Roberta Williams was fantastic, but my God, those games took themselves so seriously. King Graham of Daventry, for God's sake. You know, I mean, Daventry is, I mean, does anybody come from Daventry? Right, so Daventry is not where a kingdom is. Daventry is near Luton Airport. It's where, you know, the Boeings dump their aerofuel when they're coming in. It just, none of it made any sense. So to kind of address all of that, what I wanted to do was turn it on its head and have a serious story, but with ludicrous characters. And to be honest with you, that's what we've done in all our successful adventures ever since. The second game we wrote was called Beneath the Steel Sky, which we wrote with a comic book artist called Dave Gibbons. And Dave was the artist behind and co-creator of Watchmen. And what he did was he drew the backgrounds. We gave him a copy of a little pixel art package, and he actually created the characters. And it was a real pleasure to work with him. And it became quite clear at this point that while we needed really skillful people within our own company actually reaching out and working with people from other industries, other creative talents, could be really helpful, provided, and I'm very jealous about this, that the gameplay and the vision was being driven by me, because I'm afraid I'm a bit like that. And Dave was great, absolutely great, and still is, because we're working again together. He is extraordinarily talented, but he is prepared to accept that the gameplay trumps everything. And I would argue that that's at the heart of everything, because frankly, you can have the most beautiful graphics and the best story, but if the game ain't fun, then no one's going to get and watch it. So that was great. And the game was very successful, went to #1, got great reviews. I'm very proud of it. Then we moved on to Broken Sword 1. Broken Sword came about because our publisher, Virgin, wanted to seriously compete with the American developers, particularly LucasArts. So the head, or the deputy head, a guy called Sean Brennan, said, look, we really need you to up your production values. And I was very lucky because I was looking for animators and went to a college in Dublin to meet up with the guys there called Ballyfermot. And the guy who showed me round had worked at the Don Bluth Studios, and he was the head of layout. And he looked at what we were doing, and he said, that's all right, but I can do better. You need to hire me. And I went, oh, yes. And then he showed me his layouts, and they just were amazing. And, you know, this is very much from the pencil of Owen Cahill, and I owe him, and many other people, but I owe him in particular a huge debt of gratitude, because he then went on to work with us on Broken Sword 2. And, you know, things like, he said, well, can we change the angle at which I draw the room? And I remember saying, oh, and of course you can't, because all the sprites are rendered at a certain level. You know, the camera has to mix that. He went, I don't think you're right. I went, of course I'm right. He said, well, can we set up a test? Can we set up a test? And he was right, of course. What happened was that, and I should have known it, that actually reality is irrelevant. It's believability. Believability is all that matters. So what we needed was to make sure that the angle was such that the eye didn't see that there was a problem. And you know, clearly, if you're looking horizontally and the angle's at this, then it doesn't work. But it basically meant that we could really play around with adventures and the views. Because before this, they'd always been from the same angle, always from a certain angle. And also, he said, why are they boxes within boxes? Why are all adventure games boxes within boxes? So, I mean, and if I go back to, you know, this, by box in box, I mean, this is a box, and this is a box. This is a box, and this is a box. And, you know, Owen convinced us that actually it would be much more dynamic to change the angles and everything. And as I say, that, you know, that was a huge revelation. And I think it's one of the reasons that people felt that the games were so fresh compared to a lot of other 2D games. So all went well until 1996. And in 1996, the PlayStation came out. And I love PlayStation and I love Sony. We have a great relationship with them. But I do blame them for being one of the reasons that the adventure as a genre collapsed for a decade. And the reason is because they were so fabulously successful, and the retailers, back in those days, you could only buy a game from a shop, and the retailers would obviously sell the games, would stock the games that they thought they were going to be most successful, so they started just stocking visceral 3D games. And they stopped supporting PC, except for the very biggest titles, and they stopped supporting adventure games. And at that time, publishers were honestly saying the PC is dead. Honestly, they really were. They were saying the PC is dead. And in a way, they were right, because retailers weren't stocking PC games. I mean, now it's just laughable. I mean, a ridiculous thing. So the PlayStation arrived, and in response, we moved to 3D. We had no choice. I mean, I'm not using it as an excuse, because in many ways, it was very dynamic and exciting to be able to move to 3D. But ultimately, we had no choice. And to many people, this is their favorite Broken Sword. So, you know, it's just different. And it's, you know, allowed us to do more with the cinematography, et cetera, et cetera. And then we wrote Broken Sword 4, which was horribly under budget. It was all a bit depressing. In fact, it was terribly depressing. I'm going to go back to that one, actually. It was terribly depressing because in 2003, our publisher, THQ, earned revenues of $10 million from the game, of which they conservatively made a profit of about $5 million. Because we were being paid in dollars, and I screwed up the schedule, we went way over and had to borrow £200,000 from the bank, which we almost recouped, but didn't quite. So going forward, the publisher had made $5 million, and we were carrying forward an overdraft with the bank of £200,000, which is not a great way to run a business. And when the same thing happened with Broken Sword 4, then it was, I remember sitting down with my wife and just saying, what do we do? You know, this just isn't working at all. And there was no way, so I did a load of consultancy, which was such fun. I worked on Doctor Who, worked on the Da Vinci Code, really, 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 really fun. But it was impossible for an independent developer to survive. So we kind of, my consultancy paid off the overdraft, and we sat and waited for something to change. And then, boy, did it change. And it changed with the release of iPhone in 2007. And I'm going to talk a little bit about, so from a really low point, where in truth, Revolution was insolvent, we should strictly have declared the company bankrupt. Somebody from Apple, just after the release of the iPhone, phoned me up and said, we think your game would work really well on our platform. And that was the turning point. He said, we can't fund it, but we'll support it. And they really, really did. And that was a big, suddenly we were able to self-publish. And to put it in perspective, one of the reasons that we'd lost so much money on Broken Sword 3, despite it being profitable, is that the way that the model worked is that we would get paid effectively 7% of the revenues, but against that would be deducted all the development costs, some of the localization, some of the things. And then the publisher would take effectively 93%. And actually, some of it went to the retailers as well. But that 93% obviously meant that they almost inevitably made a profit from a game, and a developer would only recoup if it was spectacularly successful. So this then catapulted us into the opportunities that we could do to self-publish our game. And we produced Beneath the Steel Sky, which the original iPhone was 320 by 200. And by extraordinary good fortune, that was the resolution of Beneath the Steel Sky. And then they produced the new version, which was 640-480, which again was exactly the resolution of this. So we were incredibly lucky that we were able to surf and reuse the assets. And one of the things I'm particularly proud of is that we re-released the game in 2010. You know, the first one had come out in 1996, so this was 14 years later, and it has a Metacritic score of 91%. And it just showed that all this nonsense about adventures being dead and nobody having any interest was just preposterous. And it came from people, the publishers, who really didn't understand and in some ways had a contempt for the medium and the audience. The head of one of the publishers that we were working with took me out for lunch in California. And he said, one of the reasons I make such great publishing decisions is I've never played a video game in my life. And that was why the market just got so screwed up for such a long time, because it was being run by people who, as I say, had a contempt for developers, for gamers, and for the market. This is something that really kind of blew my mind. When we were invited by Apple to be part of something called the 12 Days of Christmas. Now, I don't know if people even remember the 12 Days of Christmas. It was a European, it wasn't enormously well publicized, but they gave away a game one day, gave away a film, gave away a music track. Apple invited us to be part of it when we'd released Broken Sword 2 for Broken Sword 1. This is 2.5 million. We had 2.5 million downloads in one day. At that point, we were tracking data. I don't think we do anymore because we're too scared of... We're a little bit scared. In fact, we don't anymore, I'm pretty sure. But we were in those days. As you can imagine, our servers just blew up. 2.5 million in one day. And the interesting thing is that Broken Sword became the 10th most, or went into the top 10 most tweeted keywords in the world. And we were a small, tiny, tiny developer, 3 or 4 of us, on the verge of bankruptcy, and suddenly we are on a world stage, thanks to Apple. And that was really very much symptomatic of the way that things were changing. But what was also very interesting here is that this was the day that the game went free, and I was terrified that it was going to mean that anybody who was thinking about buying it just wouldn't, because they'd get it for free. Look at the sales there versus the sales here. So we went from whatever that is to 6 times. In other words, even though the game had been free one day and the day before, when we put the price up, sales went up 6-fold. And the sales, of course, of Broken Sword 2, which had just launched, or launched back here, went shooting up as well. And it showed that actually the whole market, everything was changing. Everything had changed due to digital distribution. And, I mean, if I take a step back slightly, that was very much thanks to Nintendo when they launched the Nintendo DS, because it was the first touchscreen. And Apple then moved forward and adapted it so that instead of requiring a stylus, obviously you use a finger. And the iPhone allowed us to do this because it was the right device at the right time. Digital distribution meant that, or ubiquitous broadband meant that you could now distribute games directly to devices, which had never been even thought about before. Nintendo, while Sony and Microsoft were batting it out to get the most polygons out of very, very expensive hardware, Nintendo brilliantly came in from the bottom and said, actually, what we're going to do is we're going to come up with the Wii, we're going to come up with the DS. We're not going to compete with you on power. So their machines were really cheap to produce, and they made profits from day one. They made huge, huge profits, while poor old Microsoft and Sony were struggling because they were selling their hardware at a loss. And what Nintendo did so brilliantly was, with all this money, is they broadened the audience. I remember one of the adverts of Nicole Kidman sitting there playing a Nintendo DS, which would have been unthinkable a few years before. And the problem for Nintendo, although obviously they've absolutely come back with a vengeance with the Switch, is that the Apple took away a lot, the iPhone took away quite a lot of their audience, because the iPhone games were able to be sold so much cheaper than a cartridge-based. So, ooh, sounds exciting next door, doesn't it? Right, so Broken Sword 5. Sorry, this has taken me slightly longer than I expected, but I hope it's kind of what you came to hear. Broken Sword 5. So we felt really buoyed. We were able to self-publish. We'd run, when we launched Broken Sword 1 on the iPhone, I went to the store in London in Regent Street, and I asked for an introduction to the store manager, and I said, "Can we launch the game?" He said, "Well, you can't launch it, but if you call it anything but launch." He said, "We've got Robbie Williams doing a signing next week. In 3 weeks, we've got the Vampire Diaries, the cast of the Vampire Diaries, but we're free in 2 weeks if you want to do it then." So we based the release around that, and we invited anybody who wanted to come along. And queues and queues and queues of people came. It was absolutely fantastic. And it was the first time we'd actually met our community, as it's now called. Because before, a gamer would go into a shop and had a relationship with the retailer. The retailer had the relationship with the publisher had the relationship with the developer. So we really didn't know at all who our audience was. And we certainly didn't know the level of passion that there were for the games. It was absolutely awe-inspiring. It was wonderful. So I'm going to play you a I'm going to play you this video, which was our Kickstarter video. And one of the really great things is that as publishers try to make more and more money, what they do is they get developers to do more and more. So we were kind of doing things like marketing plans and things. So I was actually quite experienced at coming up with a marketing plan. So I thought for Broken Sword 5, this really was all or nothing. If this didn't work, we were screwed. So the message I was trying to convey was, 1, George and Nico are back after however many years. 2, we've got the humor. 3, it's point and click. 4, it's 2D. And 5 was the jeopardy of Kickstarter. If we don't get this money, then this project isn't going to happen, which was absolutely true in this particular case. Oh, I think I'm going to have to come round and press play. Hang on a sec. When you watch this, bear in mind that we had maybe 2 minutes to try and gently convey those core messages. Otherwise, people would stop watching.
Paris in the spring, the scent of blossom on the soft breeze. Love was in the air. Life was good. Nico and I had met again by chance at an art show. The evening stretched ahead. I was about to suggest dinner when fate intervened in the shape of a pizza guy with a gun. He took a life, and he stole a painting that was worth little and meant even less.
So another thing was that George, the voice of George, is Rolf Saxon, and he was back as well.
Why did he have to kill him, George? What's going on?
I don't know, but we're gonna find out. Once again, Paris had shown me her dark side. Nico and I were about to be drawn into a new and terrifying adventure together. A journey into a conspiracy as old as the written word, where ancient heresies would cause innocent blood to spill once more. I had a bad feeling. And I really hate the sight of blood.
And cut. Perfect. Terrific work, guys. Thanks, everyone. That's a wrap.
So, what's next, Charles?
That's it, I'm afraid, unless we get the funding.
That's it? Well, we had some fantastic gameplay lined up.
And we'll never bring the murderer to justice.
And I'll miss out on that cable car gig. That is a stunt I was born to do.
What about the Russian henchman that almost killed me?
Mysterious long-lost temple we're going to discover?
The exotic locations?
The ingenious puzzles.
Anyway, I think enough of that. I mean, bless them, a number of people did come back and suggest that I didn't give up my day job, which I think was probably fair enough. To be fair to me, I was standing in front of a green wall, kind of trying to get the timing vaguely right, and I'm a bit rubbish. But anyway, so and then we launched that, and it was actually very lucky because it was meant to go out in June, and then July, and then it slipped to August. And then it slipped after Gamescom, which Gamescom is a huge, I'm sure many of you know, but it's a huge consumer event and business event in Cologne in August. And more by good chance than planning, I was able to talk to all the press on the promise of what's called an embargo, that they wouldn't talk about it until we were ready. And so when we launched, suddenly we had this tsunami of press. It was absolutely brilliant. And at the time, I tried to claim that it was deliberate, but it wasn't. It was just very, very, very lucky. But, you know, one of the things that, you know, a couple of people came back and said, oh, George's jaw isn't quite right. And we looked at it and went, no, that's right. So we changed the jaw and then a couple of other things. And we changed it. And from our perspective, it was the most extraordinary opportunity to hear directly from our community. But from their perspective, they were talking to people who were actually listening to what they had to say, responding to it and caring. And so it was this amazing win-win scenario whereby we were really thrilled with the opportunity to talk to our community, and people were really thrilled with the opportunity to talk back to us. And really that was what very much built the game. As I say, on the first day, we actually got a third of what we needed, which was fantastic because, Kickstarter's really stressful, really, really stressful. But, if you get a third in your first day, then you're pretty likely to succeed. So that basically meant that we could, you could move forward. And indeed we did. Here was the first day. It drifted past and then went up and accelerated at the end. And that's, for Kickstarter, for anybody who's interested in Kickstarter, that's pretty much always the way, an S shape. Big uptake at the beginning and then a big uptake at the end. We did a number of rewards. I only show this slide because the Order of the Goat, if anybody's played Broken Sword 1, they may remember a goat puzzle, particularly on the original, that was a little bit unfair. And I take full responsibility for that. But our wonderful fans basically created something called the Order of the Goat in celebration of this ridiculously hard puzzle. And stretch goals. I said the game was going to be finished 6 months later. How could I have been so stupid as to add exotic locations in North Africa and the Middle East? How did I think that by adding locations, restructuring the story and restructuring the puzzles, that I would still get the game finished in 6 months? It was insane. Actually, that's quite a good story because come April the following year, and the game was meant to be released, a few people got in touch and said, "This is great, we're so excited. The game's due to come out, this month, isn't it?" And I had a sleepless night the night before and then put out a post saying, "Guys, I'm really sorry. It's actually going to be the end of the year." And I expected a really big response and got one. Half the people said, "Well, we didn't believe you in the first place anyway, so that's fine." And honestly, and the other half said, "Well, we've been waiting 5 years, so we're very happy to wait for another 6 months." And it became quite clear that our community was so much on our side. They wanted to be part of the trials and tribulations. They wanted to be part of the highs, part of the lows. So as long as we were honest with them, which we were as far as we could, because obviously we didn't give away too much, it was clear that they were coming along for the ride, and that's what they were buying into. We actually put it onto PayPal as well, because I didn't realize this, but in Germany, an awful lot of people don't have credit cards. They use debit cards. So without a credit card, you can't pledge on Kickstarter. Likewise, in places like South America, sometimes people don't have banks. They use the mobile phone as a way. We kind of make assumptions that everybody around the world is like us. And isn't it wonderful that they're not? So anyway, we put in a PayPal and various other things and got an extra 1,000 and an extra 100,000. So we got 15,000 backers, and we got up to 850,000, which was a really big chunk of funding the game. It was incredible, and the ability to then communicate directly with 15,000 people was just extraordinary. That really set us up because we'd self-funded it, or self-funded it and funded it through with our community. We were able to then self-fund the game. So we were able to release it digitally, and we worked with a partner, Koch Media, who distributed it physically. And then we went on to do an iPhone and iPad version. Went to #1. Just quickly to say that this is years and years old, but I haven't seen one more recent. That on the App Store in 2013, 90% of the revenues came from free-to-play. 6% was 99 cents, and it gets smaller and smaller. Broken Sword 5 costs $10. So we weren't even this green. We were this tiny, tiny little sliver at the top there. Gosh, I was about to fall off then. We were a tiny, tiny little sliver. But the extraordinary thing is we're producing the game and have produced the game in English, French, German, Spanish, Italian, Polish, Russian, Japanese, and Chinese. So what we can do is we can go all over the world, and that little slither for a small developer is really, really valuable. Helped enormously by the support, I have to say, from Apple, who have been brilliant, partly because they're great guys, but partly also because for them, strategically, it's really important that I think that premium games continue to survive. And then on the basis, because we were self-publishing, we were able to do a PlayStation and an Xbox version, and then a 25th anniversary. I mean, that's terrifying, isn't it? And that was 2015. And then we come on today for the Nintendo Switch version. And I'd like to talk briefly about the Nintendo Switch version, and then ask you if you've got any questions. So let me just warn you that if I ask for questions, there is going to be a really embarrassing silence if nobody thinks of any. So please, 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 can somebody think of a question? And you've got your 2-3 minute warning. So the Nintendo Switch version. Now, I'm going to go into sort of salesman mode now, because that's what you're going to have to forgive me. Just cut through all that stuff and take what you want. But basically, the Switch really truly is a great platform for an adventure game. It's great because, and I assume that most of you have Switches, which is why you're here. Maybe a few nodding heads, great. What we wanted to do was make sure that we really allowed people to benefit from the fact that the Switch is clearly the switch between touchscreen, on the go, and Joy-Con. And at one point, the programmer came up to me and said, "Well, which one should we support, and which one should we do by default?" And then this was kind of a worrying thing, because clearly you'd offend somebody. And I've got the game here, and I'd love to show it to you, but it wouldn't mean very much, because obviously I'd be standing here and you're there. But what's great is he came up with a system whereby it seamlessly jumps or switches. So if you can play it touchscreen, and then the moment you touch one of the Joy-Con sticks, it goes to the control via a cursor, and then back and forward. I mean, another thing that, and I'm really grateful to our distribution partner, Koch, because I absolutely insisted that we needed to have the assets in 1080, even though on a Switch device itself, it makes no difference because the resolution is much lower. When people then dock it and they want to play it on a television, then if it's 1080, then you'll get it in full HD. And the other thing that we added just to make this different, because this is very much the ultimate version with all of the enhancements that we've made, but we also have put some movies on there. So making of movies, which only appear on this. And once you get to a certain point in the game, then you can, they unlock and they relate to the bit of game that you've just played, whether it be how the development team approach the puzzles, the technology, layouts, background history, etc., etc. Again, Nintendo have been a fantastic partner to work with. It launched yesterday. We did have some teething problems, and when I got hold of the Nintendo folk, the person who responded told me that she played the game as a child with her sister, and she really enjoyed it, which kind of is always good, and it means that hopefully you've got somebody on your side, which is always helpful. So yeah, as I say, the game launched yesterday. I have no idea how well it's selling, but the reviews so far have been great. I think we've got a Metacritic of 76, which ain't bad, and I'm very proud of this. I know that people will be wondering, are we going to spend our lives doing versions of Broken Sword 5? And the answer is absolutely no. We do have a new game that we're working on really hard, and we will be announcing next year. So if anybody wants to ask about it, you're welcome to. But I apologize in advance that Stefano is now walking menacingly towards me on the basis that if I do talk too much, then I will be muzzled. So we have a few minutes. I was asked to go for 40 minutes, which I have done. So if we go for about 10 minutes or so with any questions and answers, if anybody is interested at all, I have got some of the comic books, and I'd be really thrilled to sign them, name them or not name them, or give them to you unsigned, or do whatever you want. But I just feel very privileged that you all decided to come for an hour. And thank you. You're going to ask the same first question, aren't you? Brilliant, brilliant. Oh, wait for a microphone, please.
Hi. We on? Yep. Just wanted to know about the soundtracks to the Broken Sword games. They've always been really recognizable. And have you used the same people throughout? And are you involved in the sound side? Or?
Oh, I wish I was. Okay, so that's a great question. Thank you very much. The soundtracks for Broken Swords 1, 2, and 5 were all produced by a fellow called Barrington Phelan. And if anybody's watching Spectre Morse or Lewis, he is the same composer. By extraordinary serendipity, when I was working at, gosh, this would have been about 1986. I was playing for a cricket team, not very well, I have to add. And there was a young Australian composer called Barrington Phelan, and we became great friends. And then we lost touch when I moved, and I got back in touch with him, and he was thrilled. And the one thing that I do find is that, same with Dave Gibbons, same with all these people love the idea. The big bosses of the publishing companies probably do now, but they certainly didn't then. But people like Barrington, people like Dave Gibbons, people like Owen Cahill were really excited by the opportunities that they could see from the interactive medium as a whole, and adventures in particular. So the way that Barry does it is he gets his wife, Heather, who's a huge adventure fan, to play through the game and work out where the cues should be come in and out. And she takes vast numbers of videos. I mean, she works really, really hard. And then that then gives him the opportunity to score to video, and he knows what's happened and everything. I mean, he plays the game as well, but she plays it again and again and again. And I mean, just to add slightly, you know, that's really useful because they can give feedback. So I'm going to be like a politician and answer a question that you didn't actually ask. But you know, like that, our George character, Rolf Saxon, is also brilliant as well, because what he does is he's played George in all of them, and he cares passionately. Now he was in he's been in Mission Impossible, he's been in Saving Private Ryan, he's been in all these films, but by far the most passionate community that talks to him is the Broken Sword community, which is great, and he helps us enormously by just being generous with his time. But also, before I write a game, I'll consult with him, I'll send him the story, then later I'll send him the script, he'll read through the script, and he's quite critical, but in a really good way. He'll say, this doesn't quite reflect the relationship that George has with Nico, and we'll rewrite it. And it's really, really valuable. And that means that on the day, we need very little direction for the actors, because Rolf just takes complete control, because he knows exactly what the circumstances. And if any of the other actors are confused in any way, he'll explain, which is great, coming directly from the lead. Fantastic, thank you. Anybody else? Brilliant, thank you.
Hi, right at the beginning you indicated there was your mum and girlfriends who were the only really women involved.
Yeah, no, it wasn't my mum, it was Richard's mum, just to be clear.
Sorry. With girls in gaming and actually STEM as well, just how do you think we should get more of them involved? Because it's 2018 and we're still massively.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And we are a revolution. You know, we're not 50%, but we're not far off. But we kind of actively, not positive. I hate positive discrimination. But if you have two people of equal ability, then I will generally choose to employ a woman, because you know, clearly diversity is so important on so many levels. I would say that counter to that, I would just make one point, and that is that, you know, 66% of graduates are, law graduates are women, 60% of medical graduates are women. So we have to fight really hard, because we need women who can go into really successful careers like law, like medicine, and we need to try and attract them to video games. And that's something that I'm very passionate about doing. Without wishing to be political, one of the most damaging things that happened was that, you know, during the 80s, I was a huge beneficiary of the Sinclair generation. And Tony Blair's government got rid of computer science. It was just the most appalling vandalism. Were you part of that as well?
I teach it.
Oh, do you? Oh, good for you, good for you, good for you. You part of the digital schoolhouse? If not, you should. Yeah. And it was an appalling thing, and replaced it with ICT. And the reason that he did it was because computer science was difficult and ICT was easy. And you know, my sense is that, from what I can gather from computer teachers at the time, was that a lot of girls were taking computer science, and then when it came off the curriculum, it was seen as a boys' nerdy things, and they dropped out. And nobody noticed for about 5 or 6 years, and then suddenly the number of applicants for computer science, and particularly from girls, absolutely plummeted. And do you know why it changed? It changed not because Michael Gove had any interest in it, but because Eric Schmidt from Google, from from Google, came over and gave the McTaggart lecture at the Guardian McTaggart lecture in Edinburgh. And he said, "You are insane." He said, you created a generation of polymaths, and then you got rid of computer science. And it was only when he said it publicly that Michael Gove actually took notice. But to be fair to the government, I think they've really embraced it. I mean, you'll know a lot better than I do, but I think they really have embraced it. But squandering 10 years was terrible, absolutely terrible. Anyway, sorry, that's one of my many bugbears. Does that answer your question? Thank you, thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm a real fan of Broken Sword.
Oh, thank you.
Even though it's a long time ago. I just wanted to ask, how do you come up with the idea? Because I know the first game was very historically accurate. That's one of my favourite things about it. I was just wondering, was that deliberate? I mean, how do you come up with the ideas? And also, the director's cut, you added in an extra bit. Was that always something you wanted to do? Or was that just something that you felt you listened to the community?
Well, first of all, thank you for the compliment. It's a blessing and a curse. I always try and go to the locations that I'm going to feature. And it's just wonderful because not only is it great going there, but I have a professional reason to go as well, which is terrific. So, for example, you know, in Paris, the catacombs where you have all of the skulls in Montparnasse is extraordinary, and it can only inspire you. And from that, you hear the stories of the fact that, you know, the Knights Templar were they had a commandery in a place that's now called Temple, but it doesn't exist anymore. And by the time King Louis, his deputies went to arrest them, everything had disappeared, all the treasure and everything, and it had been taken through these catacombs, and then it intersected with the sewers, so they could have gone by boat, and all of these things that just are amazing stories and are authentic. And what I want is I want people to play a Broken Sword game, to look at this history and to know that what we're kind of stating as fact is fact, and that the rest, and so it's really obvious to them what is fact and what is fiction. So, I mean, part of it, of course, is that fact is so much more interesting than fiction. It just is, because, you know, the way that people behaved, the brutality that people had towards each other in those days is extraordinary. So to answer your question, then, yeah, no, I do take all of that very seriously. Both the Da Vinci Code, which, has anybody read the Da Vinci Code? Yeah, a few of you, yeah. So the Da Vinci Code, just to be clear, starts with an American in Paris, meets this sort of sassy French girl, and they almost get killed in a conspiracy involving the Knights Templar, okay? And so some people have said there's a bit of plagiarism. All I would say is that since Broken Sword came 5 or 6 years before the Da Vinci Code, if there was any, then it was from him and not from me. But I won't say any more than that. But what he did do is he fell hook, line, and sinker for a book that I'd read as course as well, called The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, that was utter nonsense. It talked about the Priory of Sion, and it was clearly ludicrous. But I kind of identified that it was ludicrous and just dismissed it. But I was interested by the Templars. I was also interested by the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, which is fascinating, and all of these things, because I just went beyond that and tried to look through what was clearly ludicrous and what was factual. And Dan Brown, bless him, I mean, I think really did believe in the Priory of Sion, because he says, fact, this exists. And I can assure him that that is absolutely not the case at all. It is the lunatic internal rantings of a fellow called Pierre Plantard, who invented it. He invented many secret societies, but his brilliance for this was he forged some papers and hid them in the Bibliothèque Nationale, which is the National Library in Paris, and never in his wildest dreams would he have imagined, I don't think, that anybody would have discovered them and followed them as Henry Lincoln and Michael Banyan did with such enthusiasm. And the whole thing was born from that. I've got just a few seconds, so I'm going to tell you an anecdote, which is, again, part of the serendipity of all of this, is that I was with my wife a few years ago in the Dordogne, just seeing a friend, nothing to do with research, nothing to do with Broken Sword. And she was waiting, I was canoeing with my son, she was waiting in a tiny little place called Carignac, which is about 300 people odd. And there was a tiny little art gallery, and she went in and there was a book with the Knights Templar cross on it. So she picked it up and she looked at it, and the owner walked over a guy called Jean-Luc Chamois, and he asked her in French, she doesn't speak French, she doesn't speak English, why she was interested. It turned out that in the 70s, he had interviewed Pierre Plantard and revealed him to be a total fraud. And so in this tiny little village in the middle of France with no connection whatsoever, we'd met the person who was the most knowledgeable person in the world, almost certainly, on the whole priority side and everything. I have no idea how that comes about, but it was extraordinarily, extraordinary. And I'm very lucky in that regard. So I've actually failed to answer your question totally. So I apologize. So where do ideas? Ideas come from what's exciting. It's about going to places, finding out about, well, in the case of the Templars, the way that the treasure was taken out and nobody found it. Where did it go? The fleet at La Rochelle sailed and was never found again. And yet, the year 1314 that Jacques de Molay was burnt at the stake was the Battle of Bannockburn, and there is a degree of suggestion that the Knights Templar, who needed to go somewhere, and the king of Scotland had been excommunicated. They needed to go somewhere safe that the Pope couldn't touch them. They might well have fought in the Battle of Bannockburn. All of this stuff is quite possible, and I thought would make a great. And then from that's the historical setup. And from that, I then work backwards. In the case of the first Broken Sword, it was creating a manuscript with the clues hidden in it. In the case of Broken Sword 5, it's a painting with some clues hidden in it. It's very useful to have something with clues hidden in it because that is the basis of a puzzle game. I think we're allowed probably one more question if there is one. Oh, I'm told no. So right. So all I would say then is thank you for coming. It's been great, and thank you for those of you who are Broken Sword fans. Thank you for your support, and it really means the world to us. And it allows us to keep going because we're a small independent developer, and our community is everything. Without it, we would be doing other things. Thank you very much.